Well, first of all, welcome Marci Shore to the Václav Havel Library. You come to us from a from a place far away, Yale University in the United States. It's a real pleasure to have you here. It is my understanding that this is your second visit at the library, that you have been here previously, but I'm so glad to have you here and have the opportunity to chat with you about Václav Havel. I am tempted to begin with the question, when did you first come across Havel? But it occurs to me that part of the answer is right on the first page of your book, The Taste of Ashes, which delves into the afterlife of totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, as the subtitle announces. May I ask you to read the second paragraph, please?
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I came to Eastern Europe for the first time in 1993, knowing almost nothing. The previous summer, at the carnivalesque parking lot of a Grateful Dead concert in Northern California, I had sat on the grass amidst the deadheads who were braiding hair, selling bagels, and smoking marijuana, and read Václav Havel's essays. The essays that had originally been published secretly in Samizdat editions. I was mesmerized by the romance of the Velvet Revolution, seemingly so untainted, and by the imprisoned playwright who became a philosopher president, who went to live in a magnificent castle, and who made Frank Zappa one of his advisors. Havel seemed so generous, so loving toward the world, so good.
Thank you very much. I have a feeling that Václav Havel would have liked this anecdote and this image of you at a Grateful Dead concert going through his essays. But what led you to pick up Havel's dissident essays in the first place? I mean, how did you get to that point? Was it just this sheer romance of what was going on in Central and Eastern Europe around that time, the Velvet Revolution, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so on?
I was at an impressionable age in 1989. It's really a generational story. I was 17 in 1989, and I was the last generation to be raised during the Cold War. And not that I knew very much about communism, but I grew up in a world in which there was an evil empire on the other side of this Iron Curtain, and there was this wall, and evil things happened on the other side of the wall, and a whole part of the world was closed. And I didn't question that. I just knew it was closed. And then suddenly it opened. And when you're 17 years old, this idea of sudden opening, the possibility of seeing what's on the other side of the wall, of being able to go through the door that's just been unlocked, was absolutely irresistible. I think not just for me, but for all of those many thousands of Americans who flooded places like Prague. There was also in my particular biography this coincidence, or coincidence is perhaps not the right word. I was looking for romantic revolution. I was drawn to revolution. I was growing up in the 80s, and it was the Reagan era, and it all seemed so depressing and banal and cynical and so devoid of ideals. And I suppose when you're a teenager, grown-ups always seem devoid of ideals. You want something more romantic, more radical. You want the world to change in some fantastical way. And so I was a teenager who was very caught up in the romance that I had missed of the 1960s, of the anti-war movement. I was a pacifist. I was very interested in the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. I was a great kind of devotee of Abby Hoffman, who I never met, but whose books I had read. And in April 1989, Abby Hoffman killed himself. And again, I never knew him personally, but that was the symbolic end of that kind of American idealism of the 1960s. And even though it was not my generation, even though I was born too late, that suicide, somehow I just absorbed it as if it were my own personal tragedy, I suppose, in this self-absorbed way that teenagers have. I went to Abby Hoffman's memorial service in Delaware in 1989 wearing peace sign earrings, and tie-dye, and the sense that it was over, that the fact that even Abby Hoffman gave up and couldn't believe anymore, that we were in this place that nobody believed anymore, that nobody saw anything for possibility of something better in humanity. And then comes this magical revolution and this peaceful revolution, which spoke to my pacifism, and this revolution that seemed to be carried out by intellectuals who were speaking in a very beautiful language. And I was a very literary kid. So I was reading a lot of novels, I was reading a lot of plays, I was very interested in theater, I was reading a lot of plays at the time, I was reading a lot of Tennessee Williams, I was reading Samuel Beckett, I was reading Leroy Jones, and so this playwright, who carries out this beautiful, peaceful revolution, and then doesn't say anything about, how we're going to get revenge and how we're going to beat people up, but has all these beautiful things to say about, my people, your country's been returned to you, and consciousness precedes being, and not the other way around, as the Marxists claim. I had no idea what that meant. I mean, I hadn't read Marx, the moment in German ideology where Marx and Engels say that being precedes consciousness. I had no idea what any of that meant, but it sounded so beautiful. I mean, no American politician had ever spoken in that language. And I thought, like, okay, maybe that's this new way. Maybe that's something that could be believed in, something that could be pursued. Maybe that's this new, better possibility for humanity.
Mm-hmm. That very much resonates with my own recollections of that era. I was a bit younger at that time, but certainly after the first 10 years of my life, during the normalization period, there was a character here who suddenly spoke a totally different language, and spoke a language of ideals and sort of a romantic ideals, and there was this amazing energy surrounding all of that. I think there is a lot to be said for your observation that the language that he spoke was very different from the sort of political language that we're accustomed to from the American elites. I think Havel's first speech in the Congress in February of 1990, many of those who assembled there couldn't really figure out what he was talking about because the difference in discourse was profound. So he was one of these romantic characters leading this process. Which of his essays did you come across first? Do you still remember, or?
I definitely remember that one of the first was Power of the Powerless. Letter to Husak, Politics and Conscience, but now the order is a little bit, now I've read and reread them so many times. But certainly the Power of the Powerless became, I was 19, and it was maybe have even been the same semester. I read The Power of the Powerless, and I read Arendt for the first time. I read Eichmann in Jerusalem. And those two texts and those two authors are probably the things that have stayed with me the most. There have been many other thinkers I've gone through intense phases of engagement with and come closer to and move further away from. But Arendt and Havel, those keys into understanding the mechanisms of totalitarianism, they've stayed with me. And to this day, all my students, everyone has to read Origins of Totalitarianism. Everyone has to read The Power of the Powerless. I mean, some of my colleagues joke that Yale is a place where no one can graduate without having read The Power of the Powerless. But I think when all is said and done, that was one of the great texts of the 20th century.
Would you say that they were the impetus for you to then maybe choose the path that you eventually chose to become a historian, intellectual historian, and so on? Or did they come after that when you already had sort of a sense as to what you wanted to do?
They absolutely changed my life. I knew I wanted to write, and I knew I was interested in history, but I would not have come to this part of Europe. I don't know that I would have come to Europe at all, had it not been for those texts. The Power of the Powerless really did change my life. And here I want to put in more than a parenthetical reference to Paul Wilson, who is the translator, because if it hadn't been for Paul's translations, You know, and again, this is a long time ago, right? This is pre-internet. This is before Google Translate. This is before everything was accessible to everyone. You know, this was, if it hadn't been for Paul's labor of love, and those were difficult texts to translate, you know, if they hadn't been out there available in such beautiful language, they never would have grabbed me. I mean, if it hadn't been for what Paul did, my whole life would have taken a different course. And from that also comes my interest in translation, which has also lasted to this day. And those translations were extraordinary, and they're very difficult things to translate. And Paul, as you know, is a very modest person. But that's just a fantastic accomplishment.
Yeah, I have to agree. And Paul rightfully has a small place reserved all to himself in the Museum of Literature in Bubenec. It was just recently moved there to a new location. And in the section 1 literature, which studies essentially normalization era literature and dissident literature, Paul Wilson, there's a small video clip, short video clip of him speaking in just about flawless Czech, sitting next to President Havel. And I do have to say that with Václav Havel and anybody else for whom the language is not just the medium, but really the subject matter, the work of the translator is all that more impressive. You subsequently spent quite a bit of time in Central Europe, and including the Czech Republic, a semester in Domažlice, teaching English, I believe, at the gymnasium. Did you find your happy end? Did you find the romantic conclusion of the story of the Velvet Revolution, of people being liberated, of a playwright become president during your time here? Or did your initial experience of Czech society, politics and history in the mid-1990s perhaps complicate your understanding of the event and the main characters?
Definitely the latter. I mean, and this, of course, is the trope of life in general. And in some ways, it's the trope of coming of age, right? There's this moment of great idealism and then this moment of the crashing of the idealism where you realize that not everybody is living happily ever after, which is a moment, in some ways, all of the West is living now with this war in Ukraine. But wait, we thought there was an end of history. We thought everyone was moving towards liberal democracy. Domažlice was a radically educational experience for me, anthropologically, sociologically, politically. You know, it was a place where the revolution was just not felt that way. I mean, I thought it was the Wicked Witch is dead, and everybody was celebrating, and everybody was happy. And people were not happy. They were, by and large, not happy. They were struggling under the economic transition. Suddenly, everything was more difficult. Everything was more expensive. Everything was more competitive. Moreover, the same communist, apparatchiks who controlled the razítka, the stamps. What was one of the first words I learned in Czech was razítka, because you can't do anything without those stamps. And the people who had them, the bureaucrats, then had an enormous amount of power, which they wielded over other people. And then you started to see how people wielded power just because they had it, just because that was the structure of the situation. And also that the freedoms that people like Havel and Jan Urban and people who sat in prison, and Martin Palos and people, Ladislav Hejdanek, these people I met who were willing to go through an enormous amount of suffering, so that they could speak the truth. Many people just didn't care about that very much. There were many people who were really not interested in reading the literature that was banned. There were many people who didn't feel that their lives were so terribly constrained. Okay, now the borders were open, but they didn't have the resources to travel anyway. They didn't have the language skills to travel. And everything was more expensive. So if anything, their lives had gotten more constricted as opposed to less constricted. And that was a shock. I mean, I also thought that now, I think it was Martin Palos who immediately started translating Eichmann in Jerusalem. And I thought everyone would be running out to read Arendt, but they weren't. They were reading Harlequin romance novels. I'm like, wait, but you've now you can read Arendt. And of course, to the circle of intellectuals, in Prague and in Bratislava, that was of enormous significance. But to most people, it wasn't. So that was a kind of sobering experience for me.
I think you're absolutely right in that the revolution, the event was experienced differently by different segments of society, different people in different parts of the country. And if we were to talk about Slovakia, which was then part of Czechoslovakia, I think the picture would have been still more complicated. How has your understanding of Havel evolved since the sort of, let's say, mid-1990s? As you point out, many in this country, and especially older generations, have grown relatively bitter about him and the Velvet Revolution. I don't think that the bitterness is as harsh as the taste of ashes in your book, to allude to the title, but the sense of disappointment, the sort of nostalgia for the stability, the security, predictability, legibility of the world during the normalization era, I think that is palpable in our society in the Czech Republic. What do you think of this disillusionment? Is it sort of a natural course of romantic hopes? As you mentioned, romance tends to come crashing down. It's part of the sort of a coming of age story for each of us. Is that where we are at now? And is it possible that perhaps out of this sobering up, there might be a new romance or a set of aspirations at some kind of a higher level of consciousness, informed by the maybe failures of the initial project in the 1990s and so on?
Okay, so I would say that I would take that question at least two different directions. So there's my relationship with Havel, as an intellectual historian, which has evolved tremendously. And in many ways, I've become still more appreciative of him. He's a major character now in a long book I'm finishing about phenomenology, and I could talk about that. And then there's also the phenomenon of political disillusionment, which is also a disillusionment with liberalism, with neoliberalism, with transition, with the revolution. The revolution always comes with a disillusioning moment, which is in some ways another subject. I remember on the 20th anniversary of '89, I was at a couple different conferences with Martin Shore, and he was very self-critical. There was a lot of kind of self-deprecating, like we were wrong, we failed, we thought we knew this, we thought we knew that. And I felt more empathetic to him, or more sympathetic to him, than I think he felt to himself. And my sense was, okay, now as someone who has studied those texts, that people, including people like Martin's father, were writing in the 70s and 80s, who I think those texts have lasted, and I teach them. But that was not a political program. These were philosophical statements. It was very existentialist. In many different ways. There was no policy prescription in them. I think Jan Urban wrote in an essay he wrote, The Powerlessness of the Powerful, back in 1992, he's like, in all of that time, and he told this to me when I met him in '93, he said, in all of that time, we never talked about what would happen when it was over. We didn't really think we would see it end in our lifetime. You were fighting as a moral stance. You were making a position as a moral stance, but there wasn't a sense of like, okay, and then the communists leave and then we put in place X, Y, and Z. So the fact that there wasn't an X, Y, and Z to put in place, historically looking back, is not surprising. You don't necessarily count on the philosophers to come up with political prescriptions. It's something different in circumstances nobody could have anticipated. And he wasn't naturally a politician. I mean, he was naturally a thinker. I teach his letters to Olga. I love those letters. But they're not the kind of letters from prison that you think, okay, naturally, then I don't tease out. I mean, the first thing that changed in my relationship to Havel was when I first came here in '93, and I had this romantic vision based on not really understanding the text, but being completely seduced by them, which was that, okay, this was an imprisoned playwright, a human rights activist. He was fighting against the evil communist, so he must have been a good Western liberal. So probably he read Hobbes and Locke, and Rousseau and up through Tocqueville and the Federalist Papers on his way to becoming a good Western liberal. And then I realized that that was not the intellectual trajectory at all, that the thinking that Havel was coming from, the intellectual lineage really goes from Patočka through Heidegger, through Husserl to Kant, in various ways. And that then set me off on, decades of reading Patočka and Husserl and Heidegger and Kant, in an effort to kind of understand where those things came from. It's a very different kind of philosophical tradition. And Havel himself was not idealistic about the West. And he had a very kind of Patočkian Heideggerian critique, about technology, he was not idealistic about Western democracy. He saw those all, consumer society also, as something that enabled people to be alienated from themselves. He was thinking very much in categories of truth and lies and authenticity and inauthenticity and the relationship between consciousness and being. Those were very different categories. And that was a way in which Americans fundamentally did not understand him. And not just Havel, but they didn't understand that whole circle. They didn't understand that literature, that we were reading. And it was a way in which my relationship to him matured as I understood those sources better. And in some ways, I feel like I've become much more appreciative of Havel. And every time I go back to The Power of the Powerless, I see there are things in that model of the greengrocer that is a key, not just, I first read that text as an exposure of how the communist regime worked. The ways in which ritual functioned, the ways in which ideology functioned as myth, the ways in which that myth had a force even when nobody believed in it, the ways in which oppression functioned. I read it as being about the regime. I now appreciate more what it says about the alienated individual who, the greengrocer, the zelinage, he's living in what Sartre would call mauvaise foi. He's living in bad faith, which is self-deception. And not self-deception about the fact that he believes in communism. He knows he doesn't believe in communism. He's deceiving himself about his powerlessness. The greengrocer is telling himself a story that he could not possibly do anything else. But in fact he can, because Havel tells us if one day all the greengrocers were to take down their signs, that would be the beginning of a revolution. Therefore, the greengrocer is not so powerless after all, because he's powerful, he's also responsible and therefore guilty, for it's the greengrocers who allowed the game to go on in the first place. And that failure to take responsibility, I now see as in some ways a much more profound philosophical contribution than just the illumination of the mechanisms of late communism.
It was probably inescapable that Havel's text, The Power of the Powerless, was initially read in that political context of the Cold War, and everybody on the Western side of the curtain, Iron Curtain, was assuming that this was a critique of just communism. But I think that it is quite clearly a sort of a Heideggerian, Patočkian critique of really Western modernity, that goes far beyond just the communist regime. How much, if at all, have you been drawn to Havel's work as a playwright? So we've now discussed his essays and letter to Husak and so on, but what about his plays? Have you come in contact with them as well?
Yes, and I read them, it's true, I read them a lot more when I was younger, because I was much more involved in theater, not as a person participating, but certainly as a person reading and a person teaching those plays. There are two moments I would mention for your listeners who might not have read them all that I particularly love to teach. One was that moment in Memorandum, this kind of absurdist office bureaucrat play where there's the self-flagellating confession at the end, and the character says, I plead guilty, I acknowledge the full extent of my guilt, I request for myself the most severe punishment. And it's funny, but it's in fact a satire of André Simon, whose real name was Otto Katz, his confession, his closing statement at the Slansky trial in 1952. And Simon was basically parroting Arthur Koestler's book Darkness at Noon, which was a roman à clef about Bukharin's final statement. So Bukharin spits this out in the 1930s in Moscow, requests for himself the highest punishment. It's too fantastical to be believed in Moscow in the 1930s, but of course it is. It's the Stalinist terror. Koestler exposes it in the meantime. André Simon spits it back out in Prague in 1952, and they buy it, and they hang him. And now it comes back in memorandum, in this absurdist mode of the bureaucracy, of the appropriation of a stapler or something like that. I don't remember the details. And it's a fantastical, metaphorical, satirical moment that I don't know whether or not it's still read that way, because you would have to know all of the series of allusions. But it's chilling if you actually know it. And the other thing I would say, and this I do still sometimes teach, I teach Audience, the Vaniek play, which I still think is one of the most brilliant illuminations of moral ambiguity under totalitarianism. So for the point of view, I know you know this play well, but for the point of view of the other people listening to our conversation who might not have known this, so the autobiographical Vaniek figure is this dissident writer who is kindly by the brewery master given a job in this beer brewery because he can't get a job anywhere else because he's a dissident and he's being persecuted. And the brewery master is clearly a nice guy. He's trying to help him out. He's not so well educated, but he's trying to do the best he can. And so Vaniek is here working in this brewery, and of course the secret police comes to the brewery master and tells him he has to write these weekly reports on Vaniek. And this is very stressful for the brewery master, because he's not a writer. I mean, what's he going to write in these reports? It's not that easy for him. I mean, if you're a writer, it's easy to write, but if you're not a writer, it can be very stressful. And so he goes to Vaniek and says, listen, this is the situation. I've been asked to write these weekly reports about you, and it's like, I don't really want to, and it's kind of difficult for me. Couldn't you just write them about yourself? Then you could say anything you want, and it would be easy for you. It would be a piece of cake. You're a writer. This kind of little thing for the secret police is nothing for you. And Vaniek says, oh, I'm very sorry, but I can't participate, in an act that I consider to be immoral, because the secret police shouldn't be spying on people. And so as a matter of principle, I can't take part in this. And the brewery master's like, oh, great, so you and your fucking principles. So you have your principles, but you don't care what happens to me. Anything, I can just get smeared with any kind of dirt, because you have your beautiful principles. But what about people like me? What kind of position am I in? What am I going to do? What kind of choice do I have? And it's beautiful. I mean, it's beautiful and it's tragic because everybody is implicated. The brewery master is guilty. Vaniek is guilty. The regime is guilty. There is no innocent choice. There's no clean space. And as an illumination of how the totalitarian regime takes away that space, it's a fantastical scene.
And the ending, of course, which is very sort of downbeat and dark. And that may be the most tragic part of the whole thing, of the situation that is created by this totalitarian system. Marci Shore, thank you very much for this conversation, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And once again, it is a genuine pleasure to have you here at the Havel Library.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me, Milan. I'm thrilled to be here.